We're joined now by Representative for We Don't Have Time, Sweta Chakraborty. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here and hoping to learn a lot about the climate plans on offer in this Democratic primary. Before we talk about particular individual candidates, though, I am curious from your point of view, in comparison to past Democratic fields in a presidential year, overall, how would you rate the specificity of their plans, the understanding that they seem to show for the climate crisis that we face?
Sure, and so that's what really stands out for this election year is the ambitious nature of all the plans across all the candidates. And there's a reason for this, right? I mean, we are in the midst of this insane wildfires that are going on in Australia, not to mention what we experienced in California earlier this year. Indonesia's experienced similar things, so has Siberia. There's so many examples of impacts of climate change that it's not surprising that people are increasingly aware and demanding that their elected representatives address it and do something about it. So Pew poll has shown that the majority of Americans don't think that the US government in particular is doing enough to address climate change, and that 9 out of 10 Democrats demand and expect more. So it's coming from that background of what's going on around the world, what the public polls are showing that is voters are concerned about. And then in addition to that, you have the enhancing all of this sentiment, these global activist movements that range from young girls like Greta Thunberg, who are taking time off school to do Future for Fridays. And her whole message is, why am I going to school and caring about my future if those who are elected and those who are meant to be looking out for us and our futures don't even care? So ranging from her and her activism that has spurred not just her generation, but across generations, all the way to Jane Fonda, who's using her celebrity platform at age 82 to strike in Washington, D.C., which she calls Fire Joe Fridays, that has been inspired by Thunberg's Future for Fridays. And then you see Extinction Rebellion and additional activist movements and existing left groups like Sierra Club, like Greenpeace, that are all just creating this groundswell of demand for candidates to really step up and to really display ambitious climate plans. So what we're seeing has never been seen before, not since the last presidential election, not even in the last 6 months. A lot of the details have only just begun to become more specific.
You know, and I'm curious too, I guess it might seem a little bit weird to start off by talking about a candidate who's no longer in the race, but Jay Inslee, of the candidates that have made their race really about one thing, he was very focused on the climate. He's out now, but how big of an influence would you say he's had on the stances that the remaining candidates have staked out on this issue?
So I would say that despite him not being in the election run at the moment, he still was responsible for drawing out the blueprint that would actually implement the Green New Deal in any real way. So he has 200 pages of just a policy wonkfest, a lot of people have referred to it as, but it really represents a career that was devoted to environmental issues. And so for that reason, to dismiss the work and his legacy and how much good ideas could really be borrowed from that would be a real shame. So I'm actually very happy to see that those that are running like Warren and Sanders have taken from the best ideas and the shared ideas that he's put forward and have adopted them, because it's not new to borrow and steal good policy. And in this case, it's really necessary. We need to see the Green New Deal implemented, and here's a real way to do it.
Yeah, so the thing that has at times frustrated me throughout this primary is that virtually all of the candidates have said that they support the Green New Deal, but they clearly don't mean the same thing when they use that term. And so I've seen recently the Sunrise Movement had they had grading that they put out for a couple of the candidates. But from your point of view, as you've seen them, the plans that they've put out, but also the frequency with which they talk about climate change, how they seem to prioritize it, what are some of the candidates that so far in the field have stood out to you as really taking this seriously?
Right, and so you've got different ratings and gradings based on which sort of groups that you're looking at and how they've endorsed or supported these different candidates. And so Sanders has really stood out at post Inslee as the new yardstick from which to measure all the other candidates in terms of how ambitious his plan is and to what extent he's overhauling societal structures and systems as we've become accustomed to, and how much he's talking about them needing to change for this new normal that will be the planet at minimum 1.5 degrees warmer by the end of the century. Now remember, we're already on average 1 degree Celsius warmer from pre-industrial levels, and look at the impacts that we're experiencing concurrently around the world. So the fact that we want to keep the overall warming to just 0.5 degree Celsius higher at max by the end of the century means that we really need to take aggressive action. So what that means is that by mid-century, we need to get to net neutral carbon emissions, which is something that all the candidates and the Green New Deal supports and is behind, and the plans all aim to get to that goal. And then what that means is by 2030, as a benchmark to ensure that we get to net neutral by 2050, we need to make sure that we have halved all carbon emissions globally. And that is why you keep hearing in the headlines and across the news that these next 10 years are so critical, because we really need to have carbon emissions by then as that benchmark to ensure that we no more than warm 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So Sanders' plan says that he will devote $16 trillion of public funding to make that happen. The issue though here, despite that being extremely ambitious and accurate in terms of that's the amount of, if you're going to do it publicly, the amount of money you would need to be able to implement that vision, he's also calling for $1 trillion overhauls across other sectors like healthcare and education. And what worries me is it sounds like that senior class student president who promises to cut school to 4 days a week and make cafeteria lunches free and to end pop quizzes. It's a lot. And so there's more measured responses to reaching those goals that have been set out by the UN and that have majority global consensus. And that's Warren's plan. She's also endorsed and adopted the Green New Deal, as have the majority of the candidates. And really there's differences across the specifics, but really who stands out right now across all of the candidates in that they haven't taken on the same sort of Green New Deal language is Michael Bloomberg. And that's an interesting person to get into because he has more than anyone had a real history in climate action. When Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords, Bloomberg was the one to step up and wrote out America's pledge and committed to still be, the slogan that they came up with was "we're still in," as in even if the federal government is not going to lead and show that leadership, we as mayors and leaders of city municipalities and state leaders, we can still come together and still show our support and still do what we would have done regardless of who was in the Oval Office. And so he was integral to the C40 Cities Summit, which also shows how local leaders can really come together globally and still implement a lot of on the ground work that needs to happen to see some of these different societal changes across infrastructure, across transportation, across food, all of that. So Bloomberg has already a history and an existing project base that he doesn't feel the same need to sign on to the Green New Deal, to adopt Inslee's plan. So he's someone really interesting to watch. He also thinks more than the others that this can be done without getting the legislative branch involved in the same way. And while I can appreciate where that's coming from because it really does align to the urgency of what we need to get done very quickly, we need to be wary of setting a precedent where we don't work across the legislative branches. Obama was hoping to see legislative action happen. And when that didn't happen during his administration, that's when you started seeing the aggressive regulations put in place through the EPA. We can't wait for that to happen, and that's what Bloomberg's trying to avoid. But in the same token, we need to recognize that we have a system in place, and it really does require working together and to be able to come up with some sort of collaboration and cooperation across party lines.
So we unfortunately don't have much more time, but I am curious. So as we both said, pretty much all the candidates say that they're going to do what's necessary to stop the climate crisis. But are there any candidates that stand out as either being very vague about what they intend to do or not prioritizing it in their speeches? Anyone that makes you a little bit uncomfortable about the prospect of them being in charge of our response?
Sure, I would say I'm less inspired by Buttigieg and Klobuchar because they have not been able to reach the same urgency that is very evident and comes across in some of the other candidates. Even Cory Booker, he really talks about climate change through the lens of environmental justice. He is going to look at every part of all the sectors that require reform through climate. That's the kind of rhetoric I think is really anticipated by voters, the 9 out of 10 that think the government is not doing enough to address climate change. So Buttigieg and Klobuchar could definitely step up their rhetoric a little bit, and I'm looking to see if they do that. Amy Klobuchar has also said that she would not necessarily ban fracking, and we don't have the luxury of allowing natural gas to continue to be part of the energy portfolio if we're going to get to net neutral by 2050. And so the one thing that Bloomberg and others have stated very clearly is that natural gas does not have a place in that portfolio. Nuclear is still up for debate. Nuclear most likely has to be part of the energy portfolio as we think about how we are going to move to a more renewable but stable, because we're not willing to give up access to our heat and our air conditioning. We're not gonna be okay with blackouts here and there like a lot of countries deal with. So we still need stable energy as we transition into renewables. And that we know is gonna require nuclear. We already get 20% of our energy in the US from nuclear. So these are the things that I'm okay with there still being debate about, but I'm not okay with some of these candidates making clear that there is no room for natural gas.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I also wanted to let people know that in addition to when we brought you on the show, I mentioned that you are the representative for We Don't Have Time. You also host Risky Behavior and the Climate and Security podcast. And so thank you for joining us on the show today and breaking down. It's obviously a complex topic, a lot of candidates to talk about, but we really appreciate what you added.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.